It's week 6 of the fantasy football season and time to set those winning lineups. I'm Jen Piacenti with Sports Illustrated, and joining me today, our senior fantasy analyst, Michael Fabiano. Babs, let's kick it off with the quarterback position. Who should we definitely start this week? I know you have one guy on this list that may even still be on waivers.
Yeah, we'll start off with Joe Burrow. Remember, there's 4 teams on a bye this week, and we've got quarterbacks injured all over the place. Joe Burrow is a guy who I've liked over the last 3 weeks based on the matchups. He's averaged over 20 fantasy points in that time. He did have a bit of a slow start to the season, but he's turned things around. I like the matchup this week against New Orleans. They gave up 24 fantasy points to Geno Smith last week. So this is an offense in Cincinnati that should be able to find success. And speaking of Geno Smith, listen, I'm in, all right? I mean, it took 5 weeks. I'm in, though. Geno Smith has been great. He's been better than Russell Wilson, Matthew Stafford, and a whole bunch of other quarterbacks that we drafted far ahead of him. He's completing 75.2% of his passes, which is bananas. He's been great. He's got the Cardinals coming up this week. They've allowed 3 quarterbacks, Jen, to score at least 19 fantasy points this season.
Yeah, Geno Smith also has the highest passer rating in the league right now, ahead of Patrick Mahomes. It blows my mind. Speaking of Geno Smith, you're saying maybe Geno Smith was always better than this guy who you're sitting this week?
Well, maybe not always, but at least the first 5 weeks of this season, and that's Russell Wilson. And I get it. You probably have to play him. I totally understand that, unless maybe you picked up Geno Smith. But Russell's not looked good. He's injured. He has scored fewer than 18 fantasy points in all but 1 game. He's had 3 games with fewer than 12 points, and he's got the Chargers. Their defense has allowed fewer than 18 fantasy points to all but 1 quarterback this year. So temper expectations with Russell Wilson. And then Matthew Stafford. Hey, I am sitting him until he wakes up. And I don't know that that's going to happen even this week against Carolina. It's not like this is an awful matchup, but look at Stafford's offensive line. That's really the offensive thing going on in Los Angeles. They cannot protect him. Stafford's been taking a beating. And again, this isn't a terrible matchup. I think Stafford's probably just outside of the QB1s. But if you have a Geno Smith, for example, I would be sitting Matthew Stafford. Let's hope he wakes up this week, because it has been rough sledding, not only for Stafford's fantasy managers, but also the Rams offense.
Moving over to the running back position, they've got a new quarterback under center, a rookie. So you say start the next running back up in New England.
Right, and that's for Madre Stevenson. Damien Harris is going to miss a few weeks. And Stevenson was bananas good last week against the Lions. And now he's got another good matchup against the Cleveland Browns. Their defense has surrendered the 5th most fantasy points to running backs, and Stevenson's going to be the featured back for Bill Belichick, so start him. He's in my top 10 this week. I also like Breece Hall. He's really taken over as the Jets' top running back ahead of Michael Carter. Look at the numbers over the last 3 weeks. He should have scored 2 touchdowns in addition to the one he had last week, but he got tackled at the 1-yard line. They brought in Michael Carter twice. The Packers defense has allowed 4 running backs to score 13 plus fantasy points this season, including 3 who have gone over 15. So Breece Hall is a good play. And one other quick play, Eno Benjamin. If you picked him up off the waiver wire, start him this week.
A lot of questions about what to do about Najee Harris. Of course, he had a tough matchup last week versus Buffalo, but it doesn't really look any easier this week versus Tampa Bay, right?
I can't believe I have him as a sit. He was so good last year. I really wish Ben Roethlisberger were back, just for selfish fantasy purposes. But Najee Harris, averaging 10.3 fantasy points per game. That's been terrible. He's been awful the last 2 weeks, scoring 14 points combined. And the Buccaneers have allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points to running backs. I get it. You probably have to play him in DFS, avoid him at all costs. And then Zeke, he's been to sit him every week for me. And he's only made me look bad once. And I hate that because I'm a Cowboys fan, but I can't play him against the Eagles. I mean, this defense held Dalvin Cook and James Robinson to a combined 10.5 fantasy points at the link earlier this season. Zeke is a fade. I think Tony Pollard's probably a better play at this point, but I'm not playing Ezekiel Elliott as much as it pains me.
We've talked about this before, but sometimes wide receivers can still have great games despite the fact that they have poor quarterback play. And I think that's what you're suggesting here when you say go ahead and start Michael Pittman.
Right, it's not that I love Matt Ryan. I have to start him in one of my leagues, though. I'm not looking forward to that. But Michael Pittman, he's actually had a couple of stinkers in a row, right? 17 combined fantasy points in his last 2 games. But I do like him against the Jags. They've surrendered 13 plus fantasy points to 4 different receivers who line out wide, including Jahan Dotson Ashton Dulin, and Joshua Palmer. Jen, not exactly elite fantasy names. And then Gabe Davis. This is going to be the play of all plays this week, right? Everyone's going to talk about Gabe Davis. He went off last week. He was just an absolute fantasy monster. And the last time he played the Chiefs was in the 2021 postseason. He had 4 touchdowns. This is going to be a high-scoring game. Start Gabe Davis. I think that one's relatively obvious.
You got a wide receiver on the sit list here. Also for the Steelers, that offense is kind of tricky right now. New quarterback, George Pickens looks like he could be the guy. And once again, you're saying maybe it's time to sit Deontay Johnson.
Second week in a row. I mean, last week he had, 11 points? It's not great. It's not great at all. And he's now put up 15.2 fantasy points in his last 2 games. That's not good. As you mentioned, we're seeing the rookie Kenny Pickett go to George Pickens more often. Right now, Deontay's still getting his targets. They're just not as good. Again, this is why I miss Ben Roethlisberger there. Deontay is probably a flex starter at best this week. And then I'm sitting Drake London. He had a very hot start to the season. I totally get it. You probably have to play him. There's 4 teams on a bye, but keep this in mind. Last couple of games, 11.5 fantasy points combined. Now he's got the Niners. This defense has only allowed 1 wide receiver who's lined out wide to score more than 13.6 fantasy points against them this season. And the Niners are allowing just 12.2 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That's tied for the fewest in the National Football League. So Drake London is a risk this week.
Who knew this video was going to become a love letter to Ben Roethlisberger? I mean, things I didn't have on my bingo card. Let's move over to the
fantasy, though. I do. I'm not going to lie.
It's all about fantasy. Let's talk about the tight end position. You say, again, don't worry about this guy's quarterback. He is a stud. Start George Kittle.
He has been a stud in the past. Lately, he's been bad. He really is. Jen, he hasn't scored more than 7.7 fantasy points in a game in his last 6 games dating back to last year. That stinks. But I think George Kittle is still a guy you got to play. He's got a good matchup against Atlanta. They've allowed an average of more than 17 fantasy points per game to tight ends this year. If Kittle doesn't have a big game this week, I don't know if he's going to have a big game. And then I'm also starting David Njoku. We've talked about this guy over the last few weeks, told folks to start him. He is getting targeted a ton. 48.4 combined fantasy points in his last 3 games. He's averaging 7.7 targets per game. He's had a 23.5% target share. Those are near the top of the tight end position over the last 3 weeks. I know the matchup's not great, but neither is tight end. I'm starting David Njoku.
Neither is tight end. That is the truth. You're also sitting Dalton Schultz. I imagine this has a lot to do with the knee injury and, of course, also the way the Cowboys are using their offense right now.
Schultz has disappeared. I mean, he's done a Houdini act. Cooper Rush doesn't throw the ball to him. And Schultz has been banged up a bunch. He's got that knee, as you mentioned. And he's got the Eagles. Like, there's nothing good about this matchup. There's nothing good about the fact that he's 100%, not 100%, excuse me. And I just don't see the targets there, so I can't play him. I actually dropped Dalton Schultz in one of my leagues. And then Hayden Hurst. Now, okay, we told you to play him last week. He had a big game. But it's not like he's Travis Kelce, okay? He is still a matchup-based starter. He's got the Saints this week. Their defense has not given a touchdown to a tight end since week 12 of last year, and the position is averaging just 6.5 fantasy points against them in 2022. Again, 4 teams are off. Maybe you have to play Hayden Hurst. I do not love this matchup.
Yeah, it's not a great matchup, but yeah, you may have to play Hayden Hurst, and if T. Higgins remains banged up with his ankle, I can see playing him in that position. Gosh, this position just stinks. It's so tough this year. But hey, that's why you tune in to si.com/fantasy. We've got solutions for you on the waiver wire. We're going to let you know who we think are the best starts and sits. You can find them every week at si.com/fantasy. Michael Fabiano has them listed by position. But before you leave, be sure you click that subscribe button because you'll also get our videos every single week of the fantasy football season.